You speak 9 languages? The words echoed through the luxury hotel lounge, followed by a sharp, mocking laugh. A tall, well-dressed millionaire leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in disbelief. His expensive watch glimmered under the lights as he smirked at the young black girl standing near the reception desk. She couldn't have been more than 22. Simple clothes, natural hair pulled back neatly. No jewelry, no signs of wealth. Yes, she replied calmly. I speak 9 languages. The millionaire laughed louder this time. That's cute. And I suppose you're also a professor at Harvard? He said sarcastically, drawing chuckle from the people around him. The girl didn't react. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply smiled. What the millionaire didn't know was that this quiet moment, this single laugh, was about to become the most humbling experience of his life. Her name was Amara. She had learned long ago that explaining herself to doubters was a waste of energy. Confidence, she believed, didn't need permission. While others saw a young girl standing behind a reception desk, Amara carried a lifetime of discipline, sacrifice, and knowledge within her. The millionaire, Victor Hale, was used to being the smartest person in every room. Money had taught him that people listen when he spoke and laughed when he dismissed someone. To him, Amara was just another person trying to sound impressive. Moments later, the atmosphere in the lounge shifted. The hotel manager rushed in, whispering urgently to Victor. Sir, the international delegation has arrived earlier than expected. There's a problem. Victor sighed. What now? The interpreters are stuck at the airport, the manager said. Traffic delays. These guests speak different languages, and negotiations are scheduled to begin immediately. Victor looked annoyed. Reschedule. We can't, the manager replied nervously. They're very particular about time. The delegation entered the lounge. 3 influential business leaders from different countries. Their conversation moved rapidly between French, Mandarin, Arabic, and German. Confusion spread across the staff's faces. Then, softly, Amara stepped forward. If you'd like, she said gently. I can't assist. Victor laughed again. This is serious business, he said. Not a talent show. The manager hesitated, desperation in his eyes. At this point, sir, we have no other option. Amara nodded politely and turned toward the delegation. She began speaking. Fluent, clear, effortless. She moved from French to Mandarin without hesitation. From Arabic to German with perfect pronunciation and cultural awareness. The room went silent. The delegates stopped talking and stared at her in surprise, then smiled. Their posture relaxed. Their expressions softened. Within seconds, confusion turned into trust. Victor's smile slowly faded. For the next half hour, Amara translated complex financial terms, clarified cultural misunderstandings, and guided the discussion with calm authority. At one point, she corrected a misinterpreted clause that could have cost Victor's company millions. One of the delegates leaned forward and asked, Where did you find such an exceptional linguist? Amara smiled politely. I wasn't found, she said. I was assigned. Victor stood frozen. Assigned? After the meeting ended, the manager approached Victor quietly. Sir, he said, she's not hotel staff. She's a consultant representing an international education and investment foundation. Victor's face drained of color. Later that evening, Victor approached Amara, his confidence replaced with discomfort. I owe you an apology, he said. I judged you unfairly. Amara met his eyes calmly. Most people do, she replied. She paused, then added softly, but intelligence doesn't always wear expensive suits, and knowledge doesn't announce itself with laughter. Victor nodded slowly, humbled in a way money had never managed to humble him. As Amara walked away, she didn't look back. She didn't need validation. She didn't need revenge. She already had something far greater, self-worth, wisdom, and quiet power. And the millionaire learned a lesson that day he would never forget. Never underestimate someone just because they don't look the way you expect. Sometimes the quietest voice in the room speaks the most languages. Her name was Amara Johnson. Amara worked part-time at the hotel, not because she needed the money, but because she believed in staying grounded. People often assumed she was just staff. and she allowed them to think that. What they didn't see was the long journey behind her calm confidence. Amara grew up in a modest neighborhood with a mother who believed that education was freedom. By age 10, Amara spoke English and French. By 14, she added Spanish and Arabic. Later came Mandarin, German, Portuguese, Swahili, and Italian. Languages weren't just words to her. They were bridges. When the millionaire mocked her, Amara didn't feel anger. She felt something else, certainty. She knew who she was. Meanwhile, the millionaire, Richard Coleman, a self-made real estate tycoon, felt proud of himself. In his world, confidence came from money, and money gave him the right to judge. Or so he thought. Richard had built his empire from nothing, and he reminded himself of that fact daily. To him, success was visible: designer suits, private jets, and rooms where everyone waited for him to speak. He had learned to trust appearances, to assume power based on polish and price tags. That's why Amara confused him. She didn't flinch under his laughter. She didn't rush to explain herself. She simply stood there, composed and unbothered, as if his words carried no weight at all. Minutes later, the hotel manager rushed into the lobby, his face tense. "Mr. Coleman," he whispered urgently, "our international partners have arrived ahead of schedule. There's a problem." Richard sighed. "What kind of problem?" "The interpreters are delayed," the manager said. "Traffic accident on the highway. These guests speak different languages, and negotiations were supposed to begin immediately." Richard frowned. Time was money, and delays irritated him. The guests entered the lounge moments later. Their conversation shifted rapidly between languages: Mandarin, French, Arabic, and German. Staff members exchanged nervous looks, unsure how to assist. Then Amara stepped forward. "I can help," she said quietly. Richard let out a short laugh. "This isn't the time for jokes." The manager hesitated, then nodded. "At this point, we don't have another option." Amara turned toward the guests and began speaking. Her voice was steady, confident, clear. She greeted one investor in fluent Mandarin, responded to another in French, and clarified a question in Arabic, all without hesitation. The room fell silent. The guests looked at one another, surprised, then smiled. The tension dissolved almost instantly. Richard straightened in his chair. For the next 20 minutes, Amara translated detailed financial discussions, explained cultural nuances, and corrected a miscommunication that could have derailed the entire deal. She didn't just translate words, she translated meaning. At one point, an investor nodded and said, "She understands us better than any interpreter we've worked with." Richard felt a tightening in his chest. The young woman he had mocked moments earlier was now guiding the most important meeting of his career. When the discussion ended, one of the investors asked, "Is she part of your team?" Amara answered before anyone else could. "I'm a consultant," she said politely. "My foundation evaluates international partnerships." Richard froze. Foundation? Later that evening, Richard approached Amara alone. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I judged you without knowing your story." Amara smiled, not out of victory but understanding. "Most people do," she replied. "They look at the surface and assume they've seen everything." She paused, then added gently, "But real value often speaks softly." Richard nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he felt small. Not because someone had taken his power, but because he had misunderstood what power truly was. As Amara walked away, she carried no resentment. She didn't need validation. She already knew something Richard was only beginning to learn. Confidence doesn't come from wealth. Respect doesn't come from titles. And intelligence doesn't need permission to exist. Sometimes, the most powerful people in the room are the ones no one thinks to notice, until it's too late to laugh. Minutes later, the hotel manager rushed into the lobby, panic clear on his face. "Mr. Coleman," he said nervously, "we have an issue. Our international investors have arrived early. Their interpreter hasn't shown up." Richard frowned. "So, find another one." "That's the problem," the manager replied. "They speak multiple languages, and none of our staff can communicate properly." The investors entered the lounge, three powerful figures from different countries, speaking rapidly among themselves in Mandarin, Arabic, and German. Confusion filled the room. Then Amara gently stepped forward. "If you'd like," she said softly. "I can't help." Richard scoffed. "You? This is serious business." The manager hesitated but nodded. "At this point, we have no choice." Amara turned to the investors and began speaking, flawlessly. Mandarin, Arabic, German. The room went silent. The investors' faces lit up with surprise, then relief. They smiled, laughed, and immediately relaxed. The conversation flowed smoothly, effortlessly. Richard's mouth slowly fell open. Amara moved between languages with ease, her tone respectful and precise. She didn't just translate words, she captured meaning, emotion, and intent. When one investor spoke quickly, she responded just as fast. When another paused, she clarified without interrupting. Within minutes, the tension that had filled the lounge vanished. Richard watched closely now, no longer amused. The young woman he had dismissed stood confidently at the center of the room, guiding a conversation worth millions. At one point, an investor frowned and spoke sharply in German. Amara listened carefully, then responded calmly, explaining a cultural misunderstanding in a way that immediately softened the man's expression. He nodded. Richard felt his stomach tighten. That misunderstanding, had it gone unresolved, would have ended the deal instantly. The discussion continued, deeper and more complex. Financial structures, long-term commitments, legal responsibilities across borders. Amara handled each topic with clarity and patience. One of the investors leaned back in his chair and said in Arabic, "She understands more than just language. She understands people." Amara smiled politely and continued. Nearly 40 minutes passed before the conversation came to a natural pause. The investors looked satisfied, impressed even. One of them turned to Richard and asked, "Where did you find such a remarkable interpreter?" Before Richard could speak, Amara answered calmly. "I'm not an interpreter," she said. "I'm a linguistic and cultural consultant. I was assigned to observe today's discussion." Richard froze. "Assigned?" The investors exchanged looks. "You didn't tell us she was part of the evaluation team," one said. Richard swallowed. "I wasn't aware." Amara continued gently. "My foundation works with international partners to ensure clear communication and mutual respect. Misunderstandings can cost more than money." The room fell quiet again, this time heavy with realization. The investors nodded in agreement. After they left to settle into their suites, Richard remained standing, staring at the empty space Amara had just occupied. Moments later, he found her near the window overlooking the city. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I laughed at you." Amara turned to face him, her expression calm. "Yes," she said, "you did." Richard exhaled. "I judged you by what I saw, and I was wrong." Amara nodded. "It happens more often than you think." She paused, then added softly, "People confuse confidence with noise. But real confidence doesn't need to announce itself." Richard lowered his head slightly. In all his years of success, no one had humbled him like this, without raising their voice, without demanding respect. As Amara walked away, she carried no pride, no resentment, only quiet certainty. Richard stood there, finally understanding a truth he had ignored his entire life. Money can buy attention, but knowledge commands respect. And sometimes, the most powerful voice in a room is the one no one expected to hear. For the next 30 minutes, Amara translated complex business terms, cultural nuances, and financial details with absolute precision. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Every sentence was clear, measured, and confident. When numbers were discussed, she explained them carefully. When cultural sensitivities arose, she handled them with respect and understanding. She even corrected a subtle misunderstanding, one small phrase that, if left unresolved, could have cost Richard millions and permanently damaged trust between the investors. Richard watched closely now, no longer leaning back in arrogance, but sitting forward in silence. One of the investors leaned toward Richard and said, "Your interpreter is exceptional. Where did you find her?" Before anyone could answer, Amara spoke. I'm not an interpreter, she said politely. I'm the lead linguistic consultant for this partnership. Richard nearly dropped his glass. What? He whispered, barely able to process the words. Amara turned to him, her voice calm but firm. My family's foundation specializes in international communications, she explained. I was sent here to evaluate whether this partnership was worth pursuing. Silence filled the room. The laughter from earlier felt distant now, almost embarrassing. The millionaire who had mocked her minutes ago finally understood the truth. She wasn't beneath him. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was deciding his future. The investors exchanged glances, nodding slowly. One of them smiled and said, "Your consultant has given us confidence. Without her, we would not have continued." Richard swallowed hard. When the meeting ended, the investors left the lounge in high spirits, discussing timelines and next steps. The deal was still possible, but now it depended on one person, Amara. Later that evening, Richard found her standing near the hotel's large windows, overlooking the city lights. The same city he believed he owned. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I judged you without knowing anything about you. Amara nodded. Most people do. Richard hesitated, then said, You didn't react. You didn't defend yourself. Why? Amara looked out at the city before answering. Because people who know their value don't need to prove it, she said softly. Time always tells the truth. Richard let out a slow breath. I built my life believing confidence came from success. From money. She turned to face him. Money can amplify who you already are, she replied. But it doesn't replace character, knowledge, or humility. Richard nodded, feeling a weight he had never felt before. Not shame, but awareness. The next morning, the investors reconvened. This time, Richard introduced Amara properly, with respect. The discussions were smoother, clearer, and built on trust. The partnership moved forward, not because Richard demanded it, but because Amara approved it. Before leaving, Richard approached her one last time. Thank you, he said, for the deal and for the lesson. Amara smiled gently. Lessons are only valuable if they change something. As she walked away, she didn't look back. She didn't need validation. She didn't need applause. She already had something far greater. The story spread quietly among the staff that day, about the young woman who spoke 9 languages and a millionaire who learned humility in 30 minutes. And the lesson echoed long after. Never underestimate someone based on appearance. Never confuse silence with weakness. And never laugh at someone's truth. Because sometimes the person you dismiss today is the one deciding your tomorrow. The deal went through, but only because Amara approved it. Richard learned something that day he would never forget. Wealth can open doors, but character keeps them open. Money can impress, but knowledge commands respect. And confidence doesn't shout. It stands quietly and lets the world catch up. Before leaving, Amara said one final thing to Richard. Never laugh at someone's truth just because it doesn't match your expectations. And with that, she walked away, not needing applause, approval, or validation. Because real power doesn't need to announce itself. As Amara stepped into the elevator, the doors closing softly behind her, Richard remained where he stood. The city buzzed outside, unchanged. But inside him, something had shifted. For years, he had measured people by their surface, by their suits, their accents, their bank accounts. He believed respect was something you demanded. That authority came from wealth. That belief was gone now. He replayed the moment he had laughed, the ease with which he had dismissed her, and the grace with which she had risen above it. Not with anger, not with pride, but with truth. The following morning, word spread quickly through the hotel. Staff whispered about the young woman who had walked into a room of powerful men and quietly taken control, not through dominance, but through understanding. Some employees smiled to themselves. Others felt inspired. A few felt ashamed. Amara never addressed it. She didn't correct anyone. She simply continued forward, as she always had. Later that week, Richard made a decision that surprised his entire executive team. He revised his company's hiring practices. Titles and appearances mattered less. Skills, integrity, and competence matter more. He insisted on diversity, not as a statement, but as a strategy. And every time someone questioned his choice, Richard remembered Amara's calm voice and steady eyes. Months passed. The partnership flourished. Trust deepened. Profits grew. But this time, they were built on mutual respect, not ego. One evening, Richard found a handwritten note on his desk. No signature, just a sentence. Real success is knowing when to listen. He smiled. Across the world, Amara continued her work, moving between cultures, bridging gaps, and helping people understand one another. She never mentioned the millionaire. She never told the story, because her goal was never to be remembered. It was to make a difference. And somewhere, a young girl stood at a reception desk, or in a classroom, or on a quiet street, carrying talents the world had not yet recognized. This story is for her. For anyone who has been laughed at. For anyone underestimated. For anyone told they were too much or not enough. Remember this. Your worth is not decided by the loudest voice in the room. Your power does not need permission. And your truth does not need applause. Sometimes the world will laugh first. Let it. Time has a way of correcting arrogance and rewarding those who stand quietly in who they are.